Can Bangladesh continue to accommodate the world's largest stateless population? With so many crises facing the planet, Myanmar's Muslim minority has been mostly left to fend for itself as refugees in Bangladesh. While the World Food Programme cuts funding in Rohingya camps, Dhaka is left asking the world for help. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Bangladesh. Bangladesh provides shelter to over 1 million Rohingya refugees. It's a population whose survival depends entirely on humanitarian aid. Right now, the vast majority is housed in 34 camps just across the border from Myanmar at Cox's Bazar. Bangladesh is one of the world's most densely populated countries with 167 million people. Though battling inflation, it is still one of the world's fastest growing economies, but supporting an additional million people would strain even the wealthiest. Meanwhile, frustrated by mired repatriation efforts, tensions between the Rohingya and their hosts are growing quickly. This week, a fire in Camp 11 left thousands without shelter. One man has been detained as police try to establish if it was an act of sabotage. It's not the first incident of its kind. Here's a closer look.
In 2017, Myanmar's military burned down villages, killed thousands of Rohingya Muslims, raped and sexually abused women. The UN described the violence as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. More than 770,000 Rohingya fleeing the genocide took shelter in Bangladesh. They joined 300,000 others who escaped Myanmar's persecution over decades. Cox's Bazar has now become the world's largest refugee settlement. At first, the stateless Muslims were welcomed with open arms, but over time, the sheer number of refugees have added pressure on the country.
Apart from their own miseries, their prolonged presence is causing serious impact on the economy, environment, security, and socio-political stability of Bangladesh.
Myanmar and Bangladesh have signed several repatriation deals, but the Rohingya have refused to go back, fearing for their safety. And the 2021 military coup in Myanmar put the perpetrators of the atrocities in charge, making the return much more complicated and dangerous. After the failed repatriation attempts, Bangladesh's restrictions on Rohingyas have ramped up. Authorities have erected wire fences around the camps, barred Rohingya from leaving the designated areas, bulldozed their so-called illegal shops, and banned some community schools. The government has also relocated nearly 30,000 refugees to the remote island of Basanchar.
They lured us with a promise of good food and good healthcare facilities, but after coming here, I found out we're not given proper healthcare or medicine.
The difficulties in Bangladesh have forced many to flee. Last year, Rohingya arrivals in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand almost tripled.
My main ambition is I can be able to continue my life properly.
In Bangladesh, our life was difficult. We were even prohibited to go out for work. The children could not go to school.
In the densely populated camps of Cox's Bazar, flooding, landslides, and poor sanitation are also threatening people's safety. Hundreds of fires have broken out in recent times, the worst among them killing 15 people. And on Sunday, a huge blaze left 12,000 people homeless.
I have 7 children. When the fire broke out, I couldn't find all of them. I went to search for others, but couldn't find them all. When I returned home, all my belongings were burned. I have nothing left.
Adding insult to injury, last month, the World Food Programme cut rations for the Rohingya due to a lack of funds. Now over 1 million refugees already living in tough conditions may soon face hunger.
So it's been 5 years since Myanmar's military forced that mass exodus of Rohingya into Bangladesh. It outraged the world. The UN called it a genocide. But now branches of that same body are cutting the funding that keeps these persecuted people alive. Joining me now to talk more about the plight of the Rohingya in Bangladesh, as well as the state of the country itself, is from Geneva, Shahriar Alam, the State Minister of Foreign Affairs for Bangladesh. Thank you so much for being with us. You know, the Rohingya refugee crisis, like several others really, was once the leading global story because of its size, because of its brutality. Since 2017, though, little, if nothing, has really improved for the Rohingya, yet still, their plight has lost its priority as a crisis. Where does that leave the Rohingya people and their hosts in Bangladesh?
Thank you. I don't think I completely agree that it has lost its priority or focus. It's only that last year the world was struck by COVID and the Ukraine war. Economies are not doing great. So the pledges that was made last year, we needed to raise about 881 million US dollars, but till date we have raised only about 63% of that. That's lowest, but we did raise only about 65% the year before last. So it's not the end of the world, but WFP, the alarming thing is slash the budget per person per month by $2. So we have informed the audience, the countries, the major contributors. Talking about major contributors, Bangladesh is still by far the largest contributor. We have spent about $1.69 billion last year in the service that we provide in terms of personnel and engagement, the security forces who is looking after the camp, and in food, shelter, and medicine and healthcare, and so on and so forth.
Right.
This year, we have let down a budget of $876 million. UNHCR and IOM pleaded and called upon the major donors so that we come close to 876 this year.
You know, when I say a priority, though, I mean, there are so many crises on the planet right now that the Rohingya crisis really it's dropped out of the headlines. And even though, as I said, little has really changed for them, they're not getting the attention they were before. So you are actually joining us from Geneva because you have launched what you're calling the Joint Response Plan for Rohingyas as a UN initiative. What difference are you really hoping this will make? Is it only about trying to get the funding that you need?
No, our priority topmost is a political solution. That means a voluntary repatriation of nearly 1 million people that we are hosting for last 7 years, in fact, now. In 2016, which we don't talk much about, 65,000 Rohingyas came in, and prior to that, we were hosting about 50,000 of them, and then new plight of over 1 million or so almost. So that makes the figure 1.1 million-ish. Now, we are prioritizing a political solution, but unfortunately, what has happened then, a democratic government under Aung San Suu Kyi failed miserably to contain the crisis, and it has worsened after the coup. Tatmadaw engaging with them is very difficult, but we have opened our bilateral channel open. We are requesting neighboring countries, ASEAN. We are requesting United States and UN. And UN of late, appointed a special envoy on Myanmar. So very little dialogue in that front. So
have you had
this
any
JRP
dialogue?
is purely
Has
on
there been
humanitarian.
any dialogue at all between Bangladesh and the junta in Myanmar?
Yes. Recently, we have had meetings in virtual platform, because what we have done is we have listed down 1,300 individuals, and almost 800 are cleared. Another 500 are of a split family. So those are the one we are hoping sometime in near future we'll be able to send to Myanmar. And these are the willing ones who wants to go back home desperately. And of course, there are many more. We are working on another list of 2,000. But unfortunately,
I mean, 1,300 out
this
of
discussion
almost
is going
a
on for 2
million.
years.
Yeah, that's
Yes.
less than a drop in the ocean, it seems.
Yeah, honestly speaking, definitely. It will start somewhere. What we are terming this as a trial, because they need to go back and see their villages that they left before the atrocity 7 years ago. That it is an environment for the rest to go back gradually. And even if it is 500 or 1,000, and if they report back to the other once in the camp that a situation is better to come back, so more people will be interested. That's the
You've
hope
said
at
they're
least.
willing, but I mean, many would be surprised to hear that because all the dangers that led them to leave the country, flee the country out of desperation in the first place, all those
I want
conditions still
to
exist.
I want to make it absolutely clear that it's not just Bangladesh and Myanmar. We have UN agencies, and they are the one who is clearing it. We have a set procedure, a form that everyone is to sign and declare that they are voluntarily taking this decision to go back. So we have a UN-led process in this.
Okay. You know, your government had also pushed for the UN Security Council to get involved in order to facilitate the return of the Rohingya to Myanmar. How hopeful are you that that will happen?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it is frustrating. We know the reports that the local UN office failed and they had to remove and call back the RC, the coordinator UN representative that they had back then in 2016 and 17. That office failed to warn and raise the flag that problem is brewing, and they need to step up because if I may remind the audience that way back before Aung San Suu Kyi won the election and became in charge. It was handheld by UN, led by largely United States and UK. But unfortunately, they failed to continue the policy, and the process of democratization was well supported by Bangladesh. Up until 2016, we always abstained from voting against Myanmar just to pave the way for a better future. But unfortunately, that elected government failed, and now it's military junta, which is even worse. And what we see, some targeted sanction, and those sanctions, according to our knowledge, will have little impact or no impact at all because those military generals do not travel. And as far as our knowledge goes, they do not own large assets overseas, as in the case of other countries where UN or United States is issuing sanction. So sanction is not going to be a tool. But frustratingly, what we also see, there was a newspaper report in the UK last week that the Western companies who are in business with the Myanmar junta government is making millions of dollars and millions of pounds, and they are being benefited. So I think West needs to step up their effort and ask those companies stop doing business, because that will eventually strengthen the military junta.
We've spoken at length about that, and it seems to have made little progress on that front. And you're also talking about how dialogue really has made very minimal progress as well. So that leaves you with this issue to deal with domestically in Bangladesh. And I need you to tell me how politically complicated it has become for your government to continue hosting 1 million refugees at the expense you have to host them at, when your public isn't exactly in favor of them being there.
Yeah, it's hugely politically sensitive issue. I mean, it's purely on a humanitarian ground that Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina opened the border and allowed 1 million people. And Bangladesh 7 years ago, economically, now we are a lower middle-income country, but we were a poor country, a lot poorer 7 years ago. We have reduced poverty, all right, but to some extent, and we still have it bottom 20% to improve and bring them into the middle class category. So we have our domestic challenges, but people were welcoming. It's a Muslim majority country, and largely they were all Muslims. So there were sympathies from host community, but unfortunately, many of them got involved in illicit trade, drug trafficking, and gun running, and there were violences. And in fact, there is one incident, one way or another. We have lost our security personnel in the process in the camp. The host community people laid down their lives. They were killed in the hands of Rohingyas who are probably linked with armed groups back in Myanmar, like ARSA or RSO.
So you're saying they're bringing crime to Bangladesh? I mean, that is something in common then with the military junta.
Yeah, and it's really getting really difficult because the law and order situation in the camp is deteriorating, and we have large expat community working in different NGOs and INGOs on a regular basis after 4 o'clock. The camp is largely inaccessible for any civilians or any foreigners or any NGO workers.
That's a very dire picture then being painted, because you're saying not only is it a politically sensitive issue that your own population is in part rejecting
And the other
presence.
dimension, if I may add, that I couldn't address that, is that a failure to send back Rohingyas is a political risk for our party, and we have election year this year, and the other major opposition parties are terming this as a failure, which is obviously not in our hand. We have done that. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has done that for a much greater cause, which was humanitarian. But still the host community, because all the JRP and the countries who are coming up with supports, they have about 30% of the resources budgeted or allocated for the host community to increase their living standard and make some improvement there as well. That's how we're trying to balance between.
You're trying to balance, but ultimately
locals.
this just really ends in tragedy for the Rohingya population. They've been thrown out of the country where they lived for centuries, and now they come to Bangladesh, a country that they actually have so much more in common with, even linguistically, similar ethnic background, and they're being rejected there as well and accused of bringing crime across the border. It doesn't leave them with much sense of hope for finding any sense of state.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case. I mean, statelessness is the last thing that you need. But what we have done in recent times, since last year we have started giving them education in Myanmar curriculum. We have started training them for some possible livelihood in future, especially the jobs and skills that they need if they and when they go back. We have established. And then again, there was some misperception, but UN and all the countries agreed to fund in a new location called Basanchar, where they are making money. We have given them livelihood options, fish farming and fishing in the river, and ponds where they can culture fish. So gradually, we are giving them some hope while they're in Bangladesh.
Right. I'd actually like to talk about Basanchar for a minute, because you are still trying to move a lot of the population over to Basanchar Island. It's a place that many had considered a de facto prison island. They pointed out specifically that it's very vulnerable to climate change and cyclones that could potentially flood most of the land there and put everyone's life at risk. But still, has that controversy calmed down enough that you've considered it safe to continue with that policy of moving people to Basanchar?
It was typically the way we put it is misperception, and that actually delayed the process, because one of the major problem in the camp is hugely congested. So one of the ideas that Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina launched by establishing Basanchar, we have spent about $340 million of our own money, taxpayers' money, to decongest the camp. Now, for whatever reason, it attracted some bad press, but everyone now agreed, and we have had cyclones, we have had flooding, we have had other natural calamities. But Basanchar, as we always claimed, is built in such a way that those it's not exposed as it was originally anticipated or was spread or told. So we have a population of 35,000. In this year's JSP, United Nations forecasted that by end of this year, we will probably have 75,000 Rohingyas in Basanchar, and $64 million was budgeted and put aside. But the present facility can host up to 100,000, but that's only 10% of a million. So it's still, we need 3 or 4 such facilities, and Basanchar do have enough space to build more concrete shelter, as you are showing on your screen at the moment. And they have school, they have dedicated training center, livelihood options. It's a much better facility. You probably know about the fire that broke out in camp, affecting 12,000 individuals. Touch wood this year. This time around, there are no fatalities, no casualties. That also goes on to tell you how well the Rohingyas are trained for emergencies. But moving more people, if we can move, let's say, 1/3 of the Rohingya population from Cox's Bazar, we will see the true benefit of it by decongesting.
You just mentioned the latest fire, and some suspect it's actually sabotage, given the 60 or so cases of arson that have been documented over a 2-year period. I need to ask what your government's position on that actually is. Do you believe it's sabotage? And if you could tell us more about the suspect that's been arrested and what the potential motive is behind these actions. Go ahead.
I don't want to rule out the possibility, but I don't want to jump into the conclusion. We have formed a committee for investigation, and we'll wait for the result. But one thing that I can tell you that some of the armed group are targeting the pro-returnees, Rohingyas who wants to go back. Mohibullah was one of the leader, and the very unfortunate assassination a couple of years ago. And since then, we had to let his family, who once survived, and Canada gratefully is hosting that family as we speak. But all the pro-returnee Rohingyas are also target of some armed group of Myanmar, so that they do not convince others to return to Myanmar.
Minister,
so
I mean,
it is somewhat linked to the domestic politics of Myanmar.
Right. It is very interesting to hear you really so clearly state that there is an issue with militancy within the Rohingya population, because it's something that some have denied, and that it's being used as an excuse first for the military crackdown, and then later as a scapegoat, and as some might argue, for the Bangladeshi government to refuse to give anyone citizenship and to insist on the repatriation of this community. How serious a threat is militancy, do you think, within the Rohingya community?
Well, it is very serious. Now, one needs to understand, a persecuted million. Now, we are hosting 1 million, another 500,000 is in other East Asian countries. We have 250,000 or so from mid-80s in Saudi Arabia. So let's say Rohingya had a population of over 2 million, and they were persecuted for decades. And they were not offered a life that a national of Myanmar will love to lead or deserve. Their constitutional rights were seized, their national identification, they were excluded, so they were stateless. It's a perfect breeding ground for militancy and radicalism. I think we need to engage. I mean, we do have program where we have counselors who goes and talk to them, because they are the easy one to be radicalized. And we have experienced in recent times that there is something very wrong going on in the state of Rakhine, and it seems the local juntas are also losing some control, and some of the border, which is obviously treacherous and not very accessible. We see movements of some people, and whenever we have a drive for some arms recovery or drug groups that tip off from intelligence, and we chase them, and they go back to Myanmar, and they have free access in the bordering area, and that makes our law enforcing agencies' job extremely difficult and risky.
Minister Alam, we're down to our last few minutes, so I wanted to get in a question, at least one, about greater Bangladesh, and look at the fact that the protesters, who've been on the streets for several months now, it's calmed down in a sense. They're not quite as big as they were even 2 months ago, but there's still pressure on Sheikh Hasina to resign, particularly over what some accuse as economic mismanagement. But it goes as far to say that there has been torture of political opponents, for example, the oppression of any sort of dissidents in Bangladesh, and Amnesty International has actually supported that. Obviously, there have been no resignations. So what is your government actually doing to address their complaints, or are you just waiting out this time for the election?
They are not regular civilians or just protesters. There is no mass rise for any economic issues. These are led by Bangladesh Nationalist Party and the extreme right-wing anti-liberation force known as Jamaat-e-Islami. So I want to make it absolutely clear. And you have seen a trend, if you analyze the trend of 2014, build up to the election, 2018, build up to the election. And we have, this is the election year, end of this year or very early January, we will have a parliamentary election. And what Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina told, that all political parties are absolutely free to exercise their political rights. So that's why you see, the reason you probably see a diminishing trend is they just got too tired, because they do not enjoy a widespread support. Economically, Bangladesh has one of the strongest fundamental, fastest rising economy, graduated in 2021, aspiring to become a higher income country by 2041. And IMF forecasted, even though there was some depletion in our reserves, but we will be back at $50 billion reserve, which was even higher than before the Ukraine crisis began by 2025. That's IMF talking. And look at other economy that's suffering. They have failed to attract, enough support from International Monetary Fund, because you need to tick quite a few boxes before you qualify to attract IMF support. So Bangladesh has got all the economic fundamentals right. Our growth rate, our women empowerment, job creation is far greater than any other.
I understand, yeah, that is the case the government is putting forward. But the opposition, of course, claims that the reason any protests have died down is because there's been this level of oppression, which Amnesty International actually called an alarming escalation. But I'd actually like to speak further with you about that at another point, because unfortunately we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. Minister Alam, I'd like to thank you so much.
I'm always available to talk to you.
Great. Great to have you with us. Thanks so much for taking the time, and thanks to our viewers for taking the time as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.